Joining me now, lucky me, former Deputy Director of Speechwriting in the George W. Bush administration, now a senior fellow at Ethics Public Policy Center, my friend Pete Wehner, and former campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, Robbie Mook. Robbie, to you first. We keep talking fundraising. Joe Biden needs to beat Beto O'Rourke's first day, which was 6.1 million. Is the first day fundraising numbers the most important thing? Because we know Joe Biden went straight to a fundraiser. And what did Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders go after? That fundraiser was hosted by a big corporate donor, a Comcast donor, actually parent company of MSNBC. What matters more, where the money is coming from or how much you're raising?
Well, I think what you're really hitting on, from my standpoint, is all these other candidates, their name recognition is really small. They're going to have to get out there and communicate on television, digital advertising to introduce who they are. Everybody knows who Joe Biden is, right? So his real challenge here is to survive the scrutiny, survive the spotlight. And in presidential campaigns where the spotlight is the brightest, it's more about earned media when everybody already knows who you are. So to your point, I think what this is just one thing, by the way. He's going to have all these hurdles to get over. He's going to be vetted. He faces a dilemma that all front runners do, which is it's never glowing news. It's never, you never have a good day. You have better days and worse days. And this is one of those tests.
I want to talk about the spotlight and who it shines brighter on. Ahead of announcing his campaign, Peter, Joe Biden did reach out to Anita Hill to apologize, but she says, "I'm sorry," is not enough. A lot of people have already said, listen, he's making the effort. You've never even heard President Trump apologize to anyone. Are you concerned that the standards are so remarkably different in both parties? President Trump has dozens of women who've accused him of inappropriate behavior, sexual harassment. Joe Biden hasn't been accused of that anywhere near. Is it a risk that Democrats are going after one another or will in a way that President Trump, I'm not going to say has been given a free pass, but was voted into office after on tape laughed about grabbing a woman's genitals?
Yeah, look, if it's a moral matchup between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, that's easy. Joe Biden is a man of integrity. He hasn't done everything right in his life, but there's just no comparison to Donald Trump. I think his problem, Joe Biden's problem, is that he has to win the Democratic nomination first. And this issue of Anita Hill and what happened and how Biden conducted those hearings, that's not going to go away. That's going to get more intense. And he's got to figure out a way to try and answer those charges. I'm not sure if he's going to do that.
But is that not a gift to President Trump? If it's Joe Biden against President Trump in terms of morality, Joe Biden's got it all day long. But if the Democrats go after one another right now, and what they need to do is find a way to unite to beat President Trump, isn't that a tremendous gift to Trump?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I'm concerned about here is that, we saw in 2016 with Hillary's emails, all of a sudden, you had this false equivalence where something that she had done, was somehow compared to Donald Trump, and there was never any comparison there. I do worry about that. Look, I think part of the purpose of the Democratic primary, though, is to find the best person to go up against Trump. And I think that's going to be part of the question the voters are going to have to evaluate. Well, presumably, but let's be real about how this stuff happens these days. Voters are not reading a bunch of policy treatises. And I think what we're seeing in the field right now, people want change. They want somebody who embodies change. That's going to be Biden's core challenge in this, because he's either saying, I'm taking you back, 30 years, or I'm taking you back to the Obama administration. This has to be about the future. And I think that'll be really interesting to see over the next few days. How does he grapple with that? And I'm sure they're thinking that through. He's very smart people around him.
No doubt. Peter, I want to ask you about this. Evangelicals have been extraordinarily forgiving of President Trump and his indiscretions. Despite all of it, because of the appointments of those federal judges, because of the 2 Supreme Court justices. Should Democratic voters look at Joe Biden in the same way in terms of let's put policy forward? I mean, this morning I see Matt Schlatt saying, well, I wouldn't want one of my 5 daughters to work anywhere near Joe Biden, yet He doesn't seem to mind his wife works for the president.
Yeah, look, I mean, Matt Schlapp's hypocrisy on this is you could go on for this for hours. And I think evangelicals have made a mistake. I think they've compromised themselves when it comes to Donald Trump and how they've been in terms of.
But their president is in office. Don't Democrats have to notice that?
Yeah, look, I think if this turns into a shooting match among the Democrats, they're going to pay for it. But that's the way these things work out. You can, if you're interested in defeating Donald Trump, you can say the Democrats shouldn't tear into each other. But each of those candidates wants to be the nominee, and they're going to do just about everything that they can to try and win it. And the other thing I'd say about Joe Biden is he's the front runner, but he's not a front runner by much. So in some senses, he has the worst of all worlds. He's not strong enough to dominate the field, but he is going to be the target of all these other candidates, and he's got a record that is a target-rich environment. He's got 40 years, almost 50 years in Congress. The Democratic Party is increasingly angry and increasingly progressive, and I don't think Joe Biden fits that profile. I think he's an admirable person. But I have a feeling that this is not his moment. He may be able to overcome it, but there are going to be real challenges for him.
But what about the issue of, yes, if you've been in office for 40 years or in the public eye, all of that is going to be scrutinized. But then if you haven't been in office, that's a free pass. So now we're going to look at experience as a negative. And if you've come from left field, hey, guess what? Home run?
Well, we've seen this in our politics the last few years. I mean, Barack Obama had only been in the state Senate.
Itself?
Well, I think Barack Obama was a terrific president. He'd been in the state Senate 2 years before he was sworn in as president. But I want to pick up on something you were saying. I think the person who's really benefiting from all this is Bernie Sanders. Okay, he was sworn into Congress in 1991. So he's been, he certainly wasn't there as long as Joe Biden, but he's been there a long time. I would argue he is the front runner, or at least the co-front runner in this race. But because Joe Biden was the vice president, that spotlight is all on Joe Biden right now. It's giving Bernie a lot of space to maneuver. So I think Biden entering in the race may, in a strange way, be a real advantage for him.
Bernie Sanders also has a very similar message that Trump did just a couple of years ago, and it is that economic populism message. So those voters he can grab are those hardcore Trump voters.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.